Get a good sense of an interesting story next. So, all that to come.
Hey, which one do you use, Mark Thompson?
Use Mark Thompson.
The Mark Thompson Show.
I have the book here that I'm excited to show to you and save and share with you, I should say. Steve Procco wrote it. It's called Captured Freedom. And I mentioned this in the first hour, on its cover, it has a photo of those people from the Civil War. These are all soldiers from the Civil War who were taken prisoner. They were officers in the Union Regiment. And Steve Procco went back and figured out the actual identities because they had been misidentified, I believe. And then the backstory. And then he puts that backstory into a context of the Civil War and everything that was going on. He's with us now, and he can explain more. Steve Procco, everybody. Hi, Steve.
Thank you. How you doing?
Captured Freedom is the book. It's so interesting that you were so intrigued by this picture, I guess. How did this come to you, this idea to track this down?
Well, I was researching for a documentary and that had a Civil War topic behind it. And somebody shared this photograph with me in a chat room and kind of asked me, what do you think of this one? And I'd never seen anything like it. I mean, you see pictures from that era and they're, a couple people or whatever, but a big picture of 12 ragged men, very interesting. And the guy said to me, well, the guy on the far left is my two-time great uncle. And so that just really intrigued me. And I just wanted to find out what the story was on the men in this picture.
There it is, yeah. So were they misidentified, Steve? Was it difficult to ID them? Were they misidentified? How did you go about it?
They were misidentified in different places. The picture, I immediately found it in a couple of major institutions, Library of Congress, National Archives. When I got to Chicago History Museum, they had completely misidentified them. And then I found that to be the reoccurring theme, that some of the men would be correctly identified or the entire group would be completely misidentified. And so it really was kind of like, what was the story here and why did that happen was part of the trek that I kind of took, obsessive trek that I took.
And they were POWs, weren't they?
In the picture, there's 9 Union officers who were prisoners of war, and 3 others that were mountain guides from North Carolina who helped them get through the mountains. They were prisoners in a prisoner of war camp in Columbia, South Carolina, but they had been moved all through the South. 5 of them started up in Richmond at a really notorious prison called Libby Prison. So that there was a whole months and months and months story of them being moved around and what their lives were like.
You talk about Libby Prison, I think, in the book, and you were talking. I mean, it was hard to get clean water there. Even, I mean, it was a pretty brutal existence.
Yeah, 3-story building with a cellar, 2 stories at the top. They packed 1,200 Union officers in. It was open, barred windows that if you got close to, you'd get shot, and many of them did and were killed.
They shot a guy, I'm just trying to remember from the book, they shot a guy who was just like reading a book there, just sitting in the window reading a book. He got shot in the head and they killed him, right?
Yeah. They called it target practice for the guards below. And so, yeah, you had that as a brutal situation, getting close to the windows just to try to look out. But you also had these windows that were open. So in the wintertime, it was, freezing temperatures coming off of the James River, which was where the prison was located. And men sleeping on a hard floor, spooning with each other to try to stay warm by the hundreds.
I was interested when and again, I'm happy to talk about any one of these guys who there's just so many stories, and there's stories off of stories. Your book is really interesting. And I was just looking at the picture. I was intrigued by the guy. I was telling the audience this last hour, top row all the way to the right. That's the 14-year-old, right?
Yeah. T.R. Zachary was his name.
Yeah. Tell us about a 14-year-old in the Union Army.
Well, he was actually one of the guides from North Carolina, and the men passed through his, he lived in Cashiers Valley, which is in the western part of North Carolina. They passed through his family's farmstead. And a couple of the men passed through initially, and he asked his father if he can help them, as a guide along the way. And his father didn't allow him initially, and then let him go with the next group of men that came through. All of these guys were moving in parties of one or two, and then they all came together towards the end. But T.R. Zachary was just 14 years old, and in a family that was divided. The Zachary family, half or maybe more than half of them were very much in and behind the Confederate cause, but his father and his brothers were not. And it divided the family, which was the kind of a story that reoccurred throughout the Civil War in that region of the South.
The other thing against sort of the backdrop of the Civil War, you fill in some details. You talk about black regiments and the way they were commanded, I believe, by white officers. I wonder if you just give us a sense of the war itself, like that kind of texture I thought was very intriguing in your book.
Yeah, as the war progressed, after 1863 or so, there was a determination that they could use enslaved individuals who had escaped or free black citizens in the North to become regiments and fight. And it was also determined that they needed to have officers. At the time, it was a decision of these need to be white officers. So they went through a whole period of finding officers to lead the black troops. And one of the men in the photograph was a lieutenant. He started the war out as a corporal, and then interviewed to be an officer, and was accepted and became a lieutenant in a black regiment. It was the 19th USCI. USCI stood for United States Colored Infantry. And so at the end of 1863, he became a lieutenant in Company C of this regiment. They trained in the Baltimore area. They walked and marched through Washington, D.C., and President Lincoln saw them and their entire regiment. And then they went into battle in Virginia. But they were primarily used as guards to protect the back of the different regiments that were there, and didn't really engage in battle until he was captured.
Steve Procco is our guest, and the book, as I mentioned, is Captured Freedom. If you have any questions, please you can put them in the chat, and I'll try to integrate them into our conversation. So these guys knew each other, or only knew each other through the military?
Some of them knew each other because they were in the same regiment and had been captured together. There was 3 of the 9 officers that were that way. 2 more were in a Kentucky regiment. The rest were all individual officers who had been captured, and they had all come together in Columbia, ultimately in October of 1864. And when they all escaped, they either escaped in groups of a few people or individually, but they ultimately all came together in the mountains of North Carolina.
And when they ultimately escaped from some of these conditions that you describe in rich detail in the book, they escaped a few at a time, right? It wasn't like a big Shawshank exit, where they're right. I mean, that's the way this happened.
That's correct. Although what's interesting was when they were brought to this, what became Camp Sorghum, And it was named by the prisoners themselves because that was one of the rations they gave them, which was sorghum syrup. Over a period of about 6 or 7 weeks, there were several hundred officers that escaped, but all individually. The first in this group escaped by bribing a guard. And they were actually 9 men who then ran because when they bribed the guard, they didn't have enough money. So they stuffed the wad of cash with blank paper. The guard discovered it and began firing at them as they ran away from the camp. So these are the type of stories that are in this book. It's it's all about survival, and it's all about being under great duress in a prisoner of war camp.
Yeah, and I mean through multiple seasons, and I mean it was like these guys aren't just getting held overnight, as you describe the really rough conditions. So what happened to these guys after the war? I don't want to spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But
And it's funny, when I was writing the book, I originally outlined it and came up with the book feeling that when the story of their escape and subsequent taking the photograph itself, which is a story unto itself, was over, that was the end of the book. But it's kind of like in a movie, when you have a true story, you want to know what happened to the people afterwards. So they all went on with their lives. And really, after this photograph was made, many of them never crossed paths again. But you have a really kind of a cross section of different lives led in the years after the war. One of the men died in 1865. He had contracted typhoid way back in the beginning of the war. And when he got home, he never recovered, and he died in October. So, and he was quite young. He was only 20. The rest of them had, there was a mixed bag of different men that were very successful in life, and others who, quite frankly, I believe suffered from PTSD. If you were to look at it today, they had been wounded. They had gone through psychological torture, and they all emerged with some form of PTSD, I think. But most of them lived into the beginning of the 20th century, and several of them wrote about their experiences. One of them kept a diary with him the entire time he was a prisoner.
And what a resource that is for a guy like you, right?
Oh, it was fantastic finding that. It was a typed transcript, but that one of his descendants had done, and then we found the original diary handwritten, which was remarkable.
Can I ask you a kind of a process question? So you're inspired to do this, and in our last minute here, I really think this is an exciting project you took on, and you have to bring it all together in some kind of coherent form. And I'm just wondering, do you spend, there's a lot, I don't know how much travel's involved. I don't know how much, you have to spend to get access to something. I don't know whether you have a staff or you're doing it all yourself. So those questions are all folded into this question, which is, so do you have a budget that you lay out as an author ahead of time to say, hey, I'm going to do this investigation, and I can spend this much or this much time, et cetera?
Not really, although, I did have to spend money to research this book. I had a couple of private researchers that I employed in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, because it was cheaper to do that and have them go and find the answers to questions and for me to physically go there.
Sure.
I hired an archivist in the Pacific Northwest when we found an original of this photograph and really wanted to have it examined by a professional. So those are the things that went into it. The rest of it was honestly a giant scavenger hunt. And I just loved the detective work behind that.
Yeah.
That's what really drove me. It took 2 years to research and write this book. And
I mean, with all the detail is so rich. You could have told me it took you 5 years and I would have believed it. I mean, it's quite impressive. So these guys that you see in this photograph, their stories and the war they were part of is all in this book, Captured Freedom, from Steve Procco. And you can get it Well, you can get it on Amazon. Can you get it everywhere, Steve? Where can
It's
you get
on
it?
Amazon, and
Yeah.
there is a website for the book, capturedfreedom.com.
Oh,
So there's a couple places, and since the book just came out, really August 1st was its release date. We're in the process of getting it into all the other retail stores. It'll
sure.
be in Barnes and Noble and things like that as well.
That's just terrific. Well, we'll have a reference to it in our description of the show, and we wish you the best of luck with it, man. I think it's just terrific that you took this project on, you saw it through to completion, and as I say, you have woven this tapestry of what the Civil War was about with some specifics that just I was never aware of before. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, Steve Prago, everybody. Bye, Steve. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.